Hello and welcome to Authors Die Twice, a podcast on video games and aesthetic theory hosted by two living failures. This week we have another formless one. We begin with Bryan recounting his experience at a concert by the metal band Ulcerate. We talk a bit about metal after that as a genre, and I ask him some very normie, naive questions. Then I share some thoughts on the Resident Evil remake from 2002 for the Nintendo GameCube. I recently played the Switch version and loved it. And then we finish with a longer discussion on Algernon Blackwood's short story, Eldritch short story, Secret Worship. We hope you enjoy the conversation.
So last night I went to a concert in Cambridge, right, basically in Harvard Square, essentially, right down the street. I saw or primarily I was going to see this band called Ulcerate. They're a New Zealand extreme metal band formed in 2000. I'll try to kind of explain what they sound like, I guess, because it's a little difficult to explain. So like they're rooted in death metal, and for you and any other listeners who maybe don't know what that entails, it's hard to describe exactly what it means. There's a lot of variation within it, but it's some of the typical stuff that you'd expect in metal more generally. So like down-tuned, distorted guitars, really fast drumming with, really specific techniques like blast beats and things like that. A fair amount of atonality. So there's like a sometimes like a hatred of melody that happens with a lot of this music. And pretty frequent and abrupt changes in time signature, tempo, and key is also like really important for death metal. Like the more that's maybe the most recognizable thing about it, where there will be like maybe a slower part, and then it will just suddenly just kind of erupt into this faster part, and it's really jagged and kind of disjointed. So Ulcerate are kind of coming out of that genre, but they can also be classified on almost a different level as post metal, which is like also hard to define because it's kind of more an ethos or attitude than a defined set of sounds. Um, and I wonder, I mean, this is maybe we can come circle back to this, I guess, because I almost wonder if it relates to some of our questions about genre and like, like smart games and things like that and what that exactly means. Um, and I also wonder if it actually relates at all to the idea of postmodernism, because I'm not really sure about that. But post metal, just like post rock, is, broadly defined as a kind of like metal or rock music that uses, instrumentation and techniques from other genres, which just essentially means nothing, right? Like uh in like with relation to death metal, usually it means that the music is less explicit. So even if it's dark, the lyrics will tend to be more abstract. And I actually think that abstraction is maybe a good way later. Abstraction will come up again when we talk about the story that we'll be discussing a little later. But so, for example, something earlier this year, I went to see Meshuggah and Cannibal Corpse. Cannibal Corpse is just like slasher flick metal, like it's all the songs are incredibly violent and just disturbing and really over the top and kind of cartoonish. So a lot of death metal is like that, or it's like satanic. But post metal, even when there's really dark stuff, it tends to be more abstract and I think in a way like can be even darker, right? It can be almost more, it can get kind of like cosmic, but it can also be kind of literary. Though maybe next time around I'll talk about a different metal band that does kind of like literary stuff because I think that can be kind of interesting. Um, but sonically, post metal tends to incorporate more of a concern for texture. So like death metal feels usually super claustrophobic and like really, really close together because it's so distorted and atonal and fast. Um, but to finally get around to Ulcerate, like what they're doing because of how they're employing melody, the kind of tunings that they have, and also lyrically, the music does tend to feel pretty expansive, even when it's super negative a lot of the time. Um, and so I guess I'll say a few things about the show. I mean, it was the first show I've been to in a while where I didn't take any videos. I was just like so transfixed by the actual like music that I wasn't maybe physically able to take my phone out of my pocket and take any videos. Um, just truly incredible. Like the musicianship, I mean, I know we talked before about that other concert with Cannibal Corpse and Meshuggah, both of whom have just like master musicians, but Ulcerate, I think, is even on a different level. And then there are some similarities to Meshuggah. They're, really rhythmically complex, but whereas Meshuggah will just play the same kind of interlocking, overlapping rhythms for the entirety of a long song. With Ulcerate, there's like, there is repetition, of course, necessarily, but there's far less repetition, like the ways that rhythm is uh it's propulsive in a different way, I guess I would say. And then they also have these really beautiful melodies and rhythmic patterns that can almost feel like classical or something. Um, but I mean, I'll just say like I want to say one kind of thing that's kind of interesting that it really made me think of because obviously in any kind of music where there's the sort of guttural screaming that you find in a lot of metal, vocals obviously aren't inaudible, but they're like illegible, they become like the lyric becomes something textual rather than auditory, if that makes sense. Um, the lyrics are obscured and it's similar to what happens if you have vocals that are really low in the mix that they're so low in the mix that they kind of blend into the instrumentation and I can think of examples where that happens too on the other extreme but like going to see a band and like knowing what their music is about because you've read the lyrics but like not really being able to discern what's being yelled about on stage is kind of an interesting experience but I like today and the past few days and stuff kind of just listening to a bunch of their music and looking at their lyrics I started to realize that I think this is something that's true among certain bands. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a genre-wise thing, but a lot of Ulcerate's lyrics have no subject, like there's no a lot of it tends to be like in a gerund or in the infinitive. So there will just be like these phrases where there's no I speaking them or experiencing them necessarily. So they're just these kind of like I have some lyrics here. Stare above at projections from a vast sky in awe as it decays before these eyes. Concealed memories are foreboding to see within and envenom. These wicked and tortured dreams intertwined with the real until becoming the real. Absent in this illusion, absent from this reality, falling into the terror of this reflection. So now on the one hand, that could be my like 13-year-old poetry that I wrote when I was really pissed off. But I think that, but you kind of married with this really beautiful, really intense music, and also thinking about how, again, like the action itself becomes the subject. I'm still, sort of in the middle of this thought or trying to think it through, but there's something weird that happens with narrative, with a music like this that I think I do want to make this kind of a recurring thing because I want to think through some of my metal, favorite metal bands here. But anyway, would recommend it. They're from New Zealand. They never, really tour here. I don't know when the last time they've been here was. So I think they're obviously by the time this comes out, they'll be gone. But just incredible. I would recommend everybody to check them out.
We need a name for this segment for Brian's Metal Corner. I don't, is there any Souls like theming that we could do? Maybe like Metal Golem, you know?
Well, I could just name it after remember that thing that you said about Kentucky Route Zero, what is it, the dark heart of the system or something?
Right. Right. Yeah. This is okay. So this was our second, actually, let's go with that. Let's say this is our second installment of it was the dark heart of the system and nexus of involution, right? So do we
Yeah.
want to go with one or the other? Well,
Yeah, I don't know.
yeah, maybe we say this was the second installment or the second occurrence of nexus of involution, aka Brian's metal corner, aka dark heart of the system, aka giant metal golem.
Okay, that's
And
good.
I wanted to add that I was supposed to see a band this week called the Beths, who are also from New Zealand, and probably could not be more different from is it ulcerated ulcerated
Ulcerate. Yeah.
spirit ulcerate.
Yeah.
Um, uh, so that's just again to register the fact that I know nothing for our listeners who have probably clocked as much. I also have a poster behind me here from the Canadian band Always, which again probably a real um, Yeah, a real opposite of a death metal band or my idea of a death metal band, although they are very, very technically accomplished, which is surprising for a pop band, an indie
Mm.
pop band. Um, but yes, just to iterate the fact that I know nothing about metal and I'm a total normie and totally innocent, in this sense. So I maybe wanted to start with just a few questions. Now that we're back in this segment here, maybe you could also gradually educate me
Yeah.
in metal as a genre. And so I have a few
Sure.
questions just based off what you told me,
Yeah.
um, like questions and thoughts. The first one, I guess, is more a thought, which is about the vocal. So one thing that I think is really appealing about metal and the way you describe it, actually, this is specifically death metal, right?
Mm.
And the adjective or the qualifier death is actually really interesting there. I'm actually genuinely fascinated about where it came from historically.
Yeah.
It makes me think of like other genres or forms of art that have some essential relationship to death. Funerary art, requiems, classical requiems, but those are cases, right, where the connection is actually thematic or like um, there's content to the word to the sort of association with death. Like a requiem is necessarily about death or on the occasion of a death of a kind, I
Yeah.
think, right? Or funerary art is for dead people, and we can think of like Portnacio sarcophagus
Mm.
from months ago, the Bennett Sims story. But my understanding is that the death in death metal is purely abstract. Like it has no relationship to the concept of death or to biological death or even or it has only tenuous or tangential relationships. I don't know. You're shaking your head like maybe that's not.
I think it depends. I mean, I would actually I am coming up short a little bit about the actual maybe origin of the term, but if you listen, I mean, if you go look at like some of the at least the classic death metal bands, I mean, there is a band called Death, which is maybe one of like the it's one of the best death metal bands. Or a band from Florida. And they ended up being, it's interesting, like they are incredibly skilled musicians. The compositional style is something I couldn't begin to fathom, like how you compose songs like this, because it ends up sounding, I don't know, maybe it's a cliche, but it sounds like some kind of organized chaos, like there are riffs, there are definitely parts, the members are playing together. It's clearly very intricately plotted and rehearsed, and yet to somebody who's listening to it for the first time, it can sound totally random. Um, which is another interesting thing. I mean, I love, improvised like free jazz and stuff as well, which is, you can see there's certainly an overlap of people who like, something like Interstellar Space by John Coltrane and then Cannibal Corpse or whatever, right? That would
Yeah,
make
so
sense.
can
Yeah.
I ask about that? Because that was what
Sure.
I was going to say. So like the,
Yeah.
the death thing was a tangent, but I guess it relates insofar as it captures the notion of a kind of like formal relationship or abstract relationship to the signified of death or whatever.
Sure.
And that may be the case sometimes, maybe not. Um, I when you describe death metal, it sounds so appealing to me because it's so sort of technical and formalist and in a way abstract that it's sort of this exercise of technique, right? Of complex orders, complex rhythms, the kind of raw materials of music, which can feel like incredibly exhausted in the average pop song, even songs that I really like.
Yeah.
Um, that this is actually like it's much more akin to classical music or jazz,
Mhm.
and that as a formalist myself, I'm interested in that. I'm interested in pure technique and sort of and displays of this sort of pure technique, especially when that technique is compositional as well as performative.
Yeah.
Like I'm not that interested in seeing somebody do like the sickest drum solo ever or something, or like, or those guitar solos that are just about displaying technique. But I am interested in the technique of crafting a song, and compositional technique, which is a different kind of form, right? So the performativity is interesting, and I'm here for virtuosic performances, but what I'm really interested in is virtuosic composition. Um, and so all of that's to say, this sounds like something I could get really into, but here's where our listeners can all flame me or whatever, and I invite it because I deserve it. But it's the vocals that I can't get into, and I want to make an argument for a while. I mean, just in the most generalizing sense, having listened to like two metal songs in my life. Um, the vocals sound to me pictorial. Like they sound like they are not as purely formal or sort of like about this sort of exercise of form. And I know that sounds really like really sort of vague. But what I mean is just like the vocals of death metal feel like it sounds like the person's trying to sound like a ghoul or something.
Yeah.
You know? And
Sometimes. Yeah,
the
sometimes.
ghoulishness of it, it's not that I'm anti-ghoul, you know. I'm not a ghoul, whatever, like
Skeptic.
hater.
Yeah.
Yeah, but this is a case where it's the sort of weirdly limiting thematics of the vocal style. Um, I would say the same thing for like music where I don't know, like there's not that many other examples, but like a music that was similarly pictorial, like music that could only be sung in a British accent or something, like fancy boy music, and it had to be like indie music where you had to have a British accent, like just a kind of affected um like style that actually places you in a particular sort of milieu and a particular sort of scenic context. It sort of reminds me of like, again, this is so you have like Nexus of Involution, Brian's Metal Corner. Like this is sort of my like I guess I talked about Foray recently. So this is my like incredibly ignorant classical music corner, where I talk about classical music without knowing that much about it. But um I generally am not a fan of like pictorial classical music or like classical music that bears some relationship to an image or a landscape or a scene that's trying to like, romantic music that's trying to like make you feel a particular thing. I like Bach, like I like a fugue, or Mozart, which is like empty of content for the most part. Um, and this is a case where it seems like the bones of the music, if I can be incredibly abstract and whatever, generalizing and naive about this genre, like it feels like the bones of the music are sort of almost like neutral in Roland Barthes sense, or like sort of sh like sort of glimmering example of form and order. But then the music like sort of drags it back into this particular thematic context, and all I can hear is like, yeah, is like a zombie like yelling.
Yeah.
And that would be okay sometimes, but I would like that to be like one flavor, maybe like one style and not like the only style.
Yeah, so let me say like a few things because I know what you mean, and I actually so among the many metal genres, and it's like a notoriously subgenred genre. There's like tons of different types of metal, uh, just like anything else, I suppose. But metal people get pretty nerdy about it. I mean, death metal was never really my favorite. Like I actually there's another type of metal called black metal, which is tends to be pretty different, although again, like you need to listen to a lot of each of them to kind of know how they're different. But I usually would kind of prefer to go listen to black metal. Although I guess these days I'm listening to a lot more death metal. One thing I'll say is that there's plenty of death metal I just can't stand or don't or find boring or don't really like or whatever, and there's some stuff that is really just really pops. And it's the same way I feel the same way about improvised music. There's plenty of improvised music where, you know, it could just, I love my favorite combination is drums and saxophone. So you can have bad drums and saxophone improvisation, like free jazz or whatever. Like you might not like the style. I mean, it comes down to the style of the technique, right? So it's not just technique. It's not just about this person is a proficient, prodigy or whatever, but you have to like the shape of their style or I don't know, mixing metaphors, I guess. But there's something about the actual because what this type of music is about, for me at least, is about atmosphere and intensity, and that goes for whether there's vocals or no vocals or whatever. That tends to be a large part of what I like about at least about free jazz and certain kinds of metal music. Now, I would say I hear what you're saying about the vocals. I think that's an interesting question that we would probably have to maybe bring back up again next time. I think maybe we'll have to do like one of these where I make you listen to a few different bands and we try to like talk about how they're different or something like that, because that could be interesting. But I do think like the clearly the purpose for this, screamed or growled vocals, which again, there's some within that, right? There's a huge range, right? So I think by narrowing the scope, the range becomes way more particular. So some people have those super, I mean, they actually call it like Cookie Monster vocals, which I find to be kind of, some people do the pig squeal style vocals. Some people have the higher pitched vocals. There are some death metal bands where you can actually hear the lyrics. There are some where you totally can't. So there is a huge range, and again, within that range, it's like, it's a similar thing to, do I like this person's saxophone playing, or do I not like this person's saxophone playing? Or like, does this combination together of, uh, you know, John Coltrane and Rashid Ali on drums make a lot of sense? Because yes, it does. They're like a perfect pairing, right? So I think that's kind of how I think about it. Like I'm still, I do, and maybe an anecdote from the story that will that's not really about vocals, but maybe we'll draw this out a little bit more. At one point, I moved, so the stage, you could get to the side of the stage. It was a really small venue, so I moved to the side of the stage to just kind of watch the drummer for a little bit. Um, and I mean, again, it was really technically amazing. This drummer like did not miss a beat. I don't understand how he was doing what he was doing, and I'm pretty sure he didn't have a click track or anything in his ear, so he was just like doing these wildly, masterful, very fast-paced drumming, incredibly precise. He had like tons of cymbals, like his drum set was, yeah. Um, but, when you go do that at a concert that's about this kind of atmosphere and intensity, you're then just beginning to kind of maybe fetishize like the one instrument, and you're beginning to like fetishize the technique rather than what the technique is making possible or what it's activating. So I quickly had to go back and stand in the front of the stage again because I was just hearing the drums, I was just seeing the drummer, and like just focusing on the drums. It's like what you said. I don't want to hear a great drum solo, because essentially what he's doing in every song feels like it could just be an amazing drum solo for 8 minutes or whatever. Um, but if I can't hear the whole mix of everything, including the vocals, the bass, they're a trio: bass, vocals, guitar, drums. It kind of becomes meaningless. Like that's when it becomes to me like a meaningless exercise of technique rather than something that is pretty cohesive, right? And one last thing I'll say. I've heard many times the argument against screamed vocals, whether it's from feeling a little corny, which I think they can sometimes, or feeling like it paints itself into a corner, which is maybe partly what you're saying, or just because it's harsh and you don't like it or whatever. And I just feel like while that's true, I find metal much easier, even if it's I find it boring sometimes, it's much easier to listen to than certain very uncomfortable films are to watch, if that makes sense. So I think about it in terms of like other genres as well. There's plenty of stuff that's like way harder to experience as a viewer or as a listener or whatever than metal music, I think. So this is all just to say I am going to try to, get you to like metal because I think you would like it a lot. I mean, there's a lot of technique. You have to find a few bands that you like a lot though, I think is the kind of key thing. Yeah.
We could do a video segment for our YouTube where you just play me like snippets of metal songs and I give you my unfiltered thoughts.
That would be great. Yeah, like a reaction, like Authors Die Twice reacts. Let's do it. Yeah.
And then I'll play you some I don't know. I guess I don't really have anything that I could play that would be uh a good analogy because you know so much more about music than I do. But I'll think about it.
Yeah, yeah. You can play me some indie pop or whatever it is that you're into.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, do we want to switch gears to talking about the story for a week? So I was going to talk about the games that I'm playing, but I'm now fired up to talk about death,
Okay,
and
cool.
abstract sort of space and words that you can't understand, which are all
Yeah.
featured in this story. I'll just say quickly that I think I had mentioned on the recent episode that I was doing Spooky October and just mainly playing survival horror games.
Mm.
And I noted that I was at the bottom of the barrel and I couldn't find anything else to play. But then I found a whole bunch of other games to play. Some of them were replays. So I'll just name check a few of them just because one of them was one of the best games I've ever played in my life. And that's Resident Evil, the first one, no subtitle or anything, for the GameCube. So this is the first Resident Evil remake
Mm.
in 2002. So they actually remade it. I forget when the first Resident Evil comes up. Maybe it's either 96 or 97, I want to say. Um, Remade for with much updated graphics. But again, this is a leap of one generation. So it's Metal Gear Solid 1 to Metal Gear Solid 2 is a pretty similar um, uh, uh, gap, and the same, really the same two generations as well. So it's not like it's this massive mind-bending graphical overhaul, although at the time it would have been because the PS2 generation was maybe the greatest graphical leap at least that I've ever experienced. Um, but that game just, I don't have anything critical or like perceptive to say about it. It was just a true masterpiece. Like it's amazing how good Resident Evil 1 was. Justin Carpenter was the one who was like, you got to play this for sure. I mean, it'd been on my radar, but I generally these days I don't play many old games that are especially old 3D games because they just feel so much more dated than old 2D games.
Yeah.
Um, but actually, Resident Evil is not 2D. Okay, side note, I said I wasn't going to talk about games. I guess I'm going to say a little bit about Resident Evil because it was so good. But I'm just going to list the things I like about it. Um, it's like Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3 on the PS1 in that it's pre-rendered background. So we talked a bit about the kind of aesthetics of pre-rendered backgrounds featuring 3D models with Christopher Jason Bell a la, in reference to Final Fantasy VII. So this is a series that used the same thing. Like it would have these very incredibly realistic, much more realistic than 3D graphics were capable of at the time, backgrounds that a 3D model is overlaid on top of. So you're sort of moving this 3D model over essentially like kind of 2D space. And these games, it creates a very distinct set of limitations and affordances for play. Like one thing about a survival horror game that's often noted is that when you're in when you're in a pre-rendered background, you have no camera control whatsoever. That's literally impossible because you're just looking at a static, pre-drawn background, which means that you can be in a room and have a filmic camera angle, right? Like a low shot from the floor looking up, some lights filtering in. All of it's perfectly controlled and composed to the point where we can actually speak of like visual composition in these games because uh, the moment the player starts to control the camera, you basically lose most opportunities for controlling, essentially for the art of the image, which is something that games may seem to have but really don't have in many cases. Um, but in, say a living room in Resident Evil 1, there might be three different camera angles that you can occupy based on different points in the room you move around. And so you can be in a tiny room and not know that a zombie is 2 feet away from you. Even though the character, to go back to some of our, thinking about the Metal Gear games as well, like Jill in Resident Evil 1 like should ostensibly know that there's a zombie right in front of her because she can see the zombie right within the implied fictional space. But we, the player, can't, and so therefore Jill, our avatar or our extension, can't. So there are these weird moments of incredible tension and like fear or shock when a zombie just pops out who was next to you the entire time, but was just hidden by the camera, even though they were occupying the same space and were not at all hidden
Mhm.
within that space diegetically.
Right.
But it's also a shock that the character can't feel. And so, in some ways, like the terror or the anxiety of a survival horror scenario gets reactivated or activated uh, uh, acutely by this visual makeup, this visual logic. And so we could say that we identify more with the character only insofar as we're more scared than we would be otherwise,
Mhm.
right? Whereas, as we've discussed on previous episodes, and I sort of say this frequently, but in video games we do all kinds of things that are supposed to be scary, but they're not actually scary, right? Or
Right.
they're not actually difficult or wondrous because that's just what games are full of these extraordinary scenarios. Here, the scenario of creeping around a building, that's infested with zombies actually becomes scary, partly because of this compositional logic. And yet, that logic is precisely what contradicts what the character would actually be experiencing. Because the character who's occupying that space, again, would be able to turn their head and look around the room. They would be able to, like, peek their head in and be like, hey, is there a zombie in there? No zombie? But in Resident Evil, you can't. You open a door and you're committed to walking through the door, right? You have a cutscene. In the old games, you have this cutscene loading screen, and then you go through every time you enter a door. Like it's like in Skyrim, basically.
Yeah.
Um, So that's a cool thing about it, and the only thing I'll add that everything I just said is true of the original Resident Evils. What's cool about the about the GameCube one is that 2002 is later. By the time we're in 2002, like Final Fantasy has abandoned pre-rendered backgrounds. So Final Fantasy X is fully 3D. Um, and it's a striking like vestige of this. We don't really have pre-rendered. No A game uses pre-rendered backgrounds now for the most part. So it's this weird historical relic, but also incredibly novel and unique. Um, because I can't think of another game with graphics that good that still uses pre-rendered backgrounds. So the game looks incredible because it has like Metal Gear Solid 2 quality character models, even better because I think just because less power, but less graphical processing power is being used to render the backgrounds, the models look amazing. The lighting is incredible. It's sort of pasted on lighting, but it still looks so good. And the backgrounds are so moody and so exquisitely tailored and unique in the way that pre-rendered backgrounds are. There's no repeated assets, as I've said before. There's no repeated assets in a pre-rendered background. Um, so it's really the cool thing about playing that game just on a technical standpoint was it was like playing a PS1 game as if the PS1 uh the as if that style had just continued through history and hadn't been abandoned as a historical relic. It's like if we still had silent movies or something, but a silent movie made with 2025. I mean, it's a bad comparison because there's A, because that does exist, and B, because the disjunction experience is not as acute. Like it's not like, oh, I think we have an understanding of how to view a silent movie in the way that actually I think a lot of players now would not understand how to navigate a world made of pre-rendered backgrounds. But even so, it's really, really cool to see that level of graphical fidelity used for this incredibly outdated or antique, almost like, yeah, obsolete spatial logic. Um, the couple other just really small things, just points of praise. Everything I love about Resident Evil 2 remake that I think I talked about on this podcast before is already in the Resident Evil 1 remake from 2002. So I have to revise my impression of the series because there's a lot of stuff in the sort of nuts and bolts survival horror gameplay, like how you can examine items in the menu and the map system where you're like checking off each room and trying to find everything like all the game becomes like this sort of very cozy, as we talked about, sort of cozy exercise in clearing rooms. That's all there in the original Resident Evil remake. So it's a gap of, 17, 16 years between that and Resident Evil 2 and remake. And so I'm sort of newly astounded by how, or sorry, Resident Evil 7, I think is maybe the first. I'm gonna stop speculating because I haven't played 5 and 6, but stuff that I thought was added in, to 2017, 2018 to the series was already there in 2002.
Mm.
And then the last thing I'll say is that Resident Evil 3 remake, which I just played from 2020, the kind of black sheep of the series, even among the remake games, which are supposed to, are critically acclaimed and loved by fans. Nobody seems to like the Resident Evil 3 remake, even though it reviewed pretty well. That game rocks. It's so good, and it's unfairly criticized, I think. I'll just leave it at that. Maybe we can talk about it on a future episode.
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to do. I know I played. I think the only one that I've like played all the way through was Resident Evil 4, maybe. Which I'm pretty sure I played on the GameCube. But I have played, I think, 1 and 2, but it's been so long and I didn't finish them. So I'd love to play those, at some point. Um, but should we jump into our next topic here?
Let's do it.
Okay. So we're going to spend some time here talking about a story by Algernon Blackwood called Secret Worship, which pretty sure, from what I can gather, came out in 1908. It's one of his John Silence stories. So John Silence is uh, his kind of psychic detective character who there are at least five. I'm not sure if there are more, but there are five kind of longish short stories that Blackwood wrote with John Silence as a character. And he's usually kind of consulting with somebody, and at least in some of the other stories, he's kind of speaking with someone who had some kind of weird psychic phenomenon or kind of paranormal thing happen, and he's almost investigating and studying the case, right? In this story, he kind of comes to the aid of the protagonist, who's a silk merchant named Harris, and as many times as I've read this story, I still don't know why he's a silk merchant, like if that's like narratively important at all, but it keeps he's mentioned as a silk merchant like several times throughout the story, which I find to be pretty fascinating.
I think
Um,
he's called the Man of Silk at one point.
yes, yeah, he is. He is. Which is great. That's a good nick. That sounds like a Man of Silk. Sounds like it could be somebody's like an R&B singer, like nickname or something.
Or
Um,
Harris, comma, Man of Silk, like a like an Elden Ring boss name
yeah,
for.
yeah, yeah. Um, But yeah, it tells a relatively straightforward story. I mean, it's the first thing I read by Blackwood. It's still probably my favorite of his stories, even though there are other ones that I think are considered a little bit more classic. I read this several years ago, and I mean, I teach it, so I read it and revisit it frequently. But even before then, I was kind of always coming back to it. But it's a really straightforward story. What I think is so great about it is not necessarily the plot, though the plot is interesting and kind of fun, I guess, because it is a story where, again, this guy Harris is he's on a trip, I think through Germany, where he went to boarding school as a young boy. He's English. He's on a business trip selling silk, I guess, and he ends up visiting. He pays a visit to his old school that is in the town that he's passing through. And spoiler warning for anyone who wants to read this story and be surprised, but basically he goes to this school and the brothers there. It's like a Protestant, school. The brothers there uh, end up, the ones who are still there end up basically trying to sacrifice him to a demon. So again, it's like a pretty straightforward plot. You can kind of tell that something's happening pretty early on in the story. I mean, the foreshadowing is pretty apparent, especially if you go back and reread it. Um, but I think, I want to say a few things about Blackwood and actually say a few things about Blackwood in relationship to Lovecraft because I think they're pretty different writers, actually. But I'll just say that what fascinates me about the story and why I keep coming back to it is these certain moments of wonder, I would say, like the way Blackwood evokes what I would call a kind of wonder, even if it's tinged with darkness. And also the way that he describes. Like one thing I'll say that's different, I think, between Blackwood and Lovecraft, I think Blackwood, you feel a lot closer to the character. I feel like with Lovecraft, oftentimes I feel like I don't know anything about the character. I just know a bunch of facts about the character. Whereas with Blackwood, you hear so much about the character's memories and not just what the memories are, but how they feel. So one thing that keeps happening throughout the story, for example, is that um, as he's kind of nostalgically riding the train through these kind of hillsides and everything, as he's about to stop in the town where his school was, where he hadn't been for decades. He's overwhelmed with all these memories, and the memories themselves take on a certain agency. So they're kind of the memories are clothed in the atmosphere of the place, or so the memories like have some kind of action that they're taking on him, which I just think. I don't know. Blackwood writes it in a way that doesn't feel cliched, right? Like it's easy to write about memory in a certain way that maybe feels a little bit tired, but I think, and it's very subtle with Blackwood. I would say he's a really subtle writer. And in this story, at least the way he activates memory is really interesting. But I guess just for people who don't know, Blackwood is English. He was a contemporary and peer of Lovecraft. I think he was a bit older. Um, so he can be classed kind of among like Arthur Machen, M.R. James, some of those other kind of weird fiction writers. But the big difference for me, at least going off of this story and what I've read of Lovecraft, is that whereas in Lovecraft, the world just seems evil all the time. I think for Blackwood, it's more neutral. Like especially the natural world feels. There are moments where the natural world feels evil. So you can look at a story like The Willows, where he does have a lot of stuff where the characters will kind of go out into the wilderness or go out into the woods and end up being kind of overtaken or at least threatened by um, the natural world, I guess, to just put it bluntly. But it can also be beautiful, like so even if the natural world is menacing, there's also a kind of beauty in it, and there's a kind of I'd say maybe a more holistic approach to it, where it's not this kind of other thing necessarily, even if it is menacing. It's not quite the mysticism that you get with Arthur Machen. Like I still think Arthur Machen is maybe my favorite of these guys, partly because I think he's the most difficult and kind of hardest to figure out. And he was a lot more interested in kind of like occult mysticism and fairies and things like that. It's not quite to that extent, but there is this real concern with like the natural world and I guess how it kind of can get integrated into consciousness, maybe. I don't know, that's maybe a strange way to put it. But I think this is also, again, part of the reason why Blackwood's characters feel a lot closer, right? Like they feel like they're actually in the space they're traveling through.
Do you think that's because there's just more psychological interiority? Like we just have more access to what the characters are thinking and remembering and sensing and perceiving? Or is that not really where the difference lies? My impression on reading this, and I hadn't read this in a while, and it's, I've read plenty of Lovecraft, but it's been years now since I've really read one of his stories closely. Like I totally bought just intuitively what you said about feeling a kind of greater narrative distance from the action in Lovecraft and particularly from the characters involved. Um, and I wonder if that's because like Lovecraft is maybe de-psychologized, or simply not interested in representing mental states. I mean, he's interested in like fear or whatever, but that is more atmospheric and externalized than it is
Yeah.
happening on the level of like conscious perception and conscious cognition. Whereas like Blackwood is like the kind of amazing thing about the story about or one of the many amazing things about Secret Worship is that, as you say, we have all these paradigmatic scenes of thinking. Like the Harris is in a train and just thinking and remembering, and then Harris arrives at the German countryside and is thinking and remembering.
Mm.
And I think it towards the end of the story, like after he's almost sacrificed to a demon, I think John Silence said something like you had already manifested so much of this through your memory
Mhm.
that it was ready to sort of seize you and drag you back in. I'm paraphrasing, but like
Yeah.
part of the horror scenario, or what becomes the horror scenario, arises from the fact basically that Harris is thinking too much and remembering too much. So there's a like in sort of narratological terms, we're just lodged within the character's psyche for a greater duration and with much greater detail than, not just, uh, in Lovecraft, but maybe in a lot of horror stories. And one key distinction here would be the fictions of consciousness that you write about and are working on in Bennett Sims's work. So that might be another point of comparison too, that like just highly mentalized or mentally active horror protagonists.
Yeah, I was gonna maybe get to I'll kind of save it, but I do think there's a nice parallel with Sims a little bit later. But yeah, I would say that it's kind of interesting to think about this little constellation here too, because I haven't read M.R. James in a while, but I think both Lovecraft and Machen in different ways, there is a kind of remove from the characters because their stories feel a lot more archival, right? Like I mean, with Lovecraft, there's always some manuscript or it's an account of somebody who, like I had just read the case of Charles Dexter Ward, which uh, keeps kind of shuffling back and forth between different uh, centuries, essentially. And it's about one character who's doing genealogical research on his like great grandfather or great great grandfather who turns out to be somebody who possessed these kind of spiritual powers and somehow turned into something like a demon. I'm not sure exactly the language they use in the story. And then the same thing happens with this character, but it's all told through these accounts, kind of via somebody else, right? I think that Blackwood does tend a little bit more frequently to have those, if not first, not necessarily first person, it's usually a third person, but kind of free and direct discourse and uh, a pretty good access to the um, Yeah, the interiority of the characters, even, even something like Pickman's model, right, where we do have two characters having a conversation, it's still reported as a conversation. So we only get the access to these characters' interiority through speech. Whereas in Blackwood, it's kind of interesting because language does become such a huge theme in the story. Um, and maybe part and parcel of that is the fact that we don't necessarily only get we don't get the account of this through speech. We get the account of it through, as if it were through the actual interiority of this character, Harris. So
Mhm.
we're there with him while he's experiencing all of this. It's not, a manuscript that we found at the bottom of a moat somewhere or something like that.
I just had this is a total aside thought, but before we dive back into the details of the story, but um, I'm sure somebody has written about this, but I'm again occupying the naive position here of someone who hasn't done any research or hasn't read anything, read enough. But I do wonder now if like something there is some interesting relationship between like something to be said about trains and novels as a place where thinking happens.
Sure.
Like trains in life, and there is a kind of interesting relationship there between like inside and outside, like you're inside the compartment, you're inside your head, and yet the thing that you're inside of is something hurtling through the landscape and covering vast distances. And it's like precisely that the kind of co-presence of like being out in the world. Like you're
Mhm.
never more out and about than when you're like on a train or even more than on a plane because when you're on a train, you can like look at people's backyards and stuff, or
Mhm.
like see life worlds, or rather like more simply like towns that you'd never visit and will never visit. And this is a trope in literature too, like passing the town that you'll never visit and thinking about the people in it. But actually that like on a narrative level, like when a train factors into a story, it very often, I think, I want to say, without again having done one iota of research, uh, that a train often is a vessel for a character's thoughts, such that really like the train allows the character to think, or it's sort of a premise. Yeah, it's a way to like both, maybe it's accomplishing narrative action that it's getting moving a character from one place to another, but also allowing that character to sort of like spin their wheels, pun intended. And I'm thinking here also like D.A. Miller, the literary critic D.A. Miller, like has this line in one of his books, maybe it's the Hitchcock book about how the camera shot from like along the side of a moving train is like the signature shot of like auteur filmmaking,
Mhm.
and that it recurs throughout different great formalists or great technical wizards of film. That it sort of it's manifests like yeah, it's like the long oneer or something, but maybe a little bit before that, or a different species of that, where it's like, okay, this film is announcing itself as an art film, or as a film doing interesting things with the camera. So the train and film I think would occupy a quite different place, or a different role. Anyway, sorry, this is totally off topic, but it did just jog that. I maybe want to just like record that for as something to follow up on later.
Well, yeah, it's not only now because now you're making me think about this. It's not only, inside and outside, but it's also, as you sort of said, like um mo movement, but also just total idleness, like
Yes.
you don't have to drive a train, you have to sit down and wait for the train. And there's also schedule. I mean, there's timetable, there's like mapping that happens with a train that's really specific too. That's kind of a maybe something to think about. So I guess just yeah, thinking a little bit about that thread, I do think that's an interesting thing to think about.
Not a lot of train games, by the way. I mean, this is sorry, I'm really embracing the Formless One mandate here, but not a lot of train games. I'll just leave it at
Nathan Trainstein.
that.
Um, yeah, so no, so yes, I mean that we kind of do begin. It's also I wonder how many stories or novels begin with a character already on a train because that's how Secret Worship begins, right? I mean, I don't think we need to, go through the entire plot. I mean, I wonder if a few things I do want to talk about are the theme of language, which just seems super important here and seems a little bit it seems unique to language is obviously already a theme in weird fiction, right? Because with someone like Lovecraft, I mean, a lot of the horror does come through somebody's, not just language, but writing does come through when we get, for example, at the end of, is it the end of Hunter of the Dark, where we get like the manuscript pages from, is it Blake? Is that who it is? Who
Robert Blake.
Robert Blake? Yeah. Um, we see like his madness or like his impending doom as it's written out in real time by him while he's waiting for this thing to, come get him or whatever. Um, but in Blackwood, it's a bit different, right? Because, Harris is an Englishman who was educated in Germany and thus had to speak German, and so he was at least at one point fluent in German. But what happens when he gets back to this town is that his language starts to falter at a certain point, and that seems to be like the prescient thing for the entire story. Like that's the piece of foreshadowing that I find the most interesting, which is that he like there are scenes where he's speaking German, right? He goes to like this inn and he's speaking in German, but then when he visits the school where he was as a boy, um he keeps having these stumbles, and he keeps, especially around the specific word that translates to sacrifice or offering, when he's about to be sacrificed to a demon, right? And so his words fail him, and then at the same time we have the introduction of this demon called Asmodeus, which I have the Oxford version, which nicely in the notes in the back note that it's reminiscent of Asmodeus, the king of demons in Judaic legend. But I looked up Asmodeus, and I've definitely seen, I've seen this before, where it's usually portrayed as like a three-headed demon with like a goat head and a man's head and some other head riding on a dragon, which uh Asmodeus couldn't be further from that, right? I mean, and this is, I guess, to kind of get to it, this is why I find this story so fascinating, is that the demon, like the thing that's going to come and whatever, eviscerate this guy or maybe absorb him or take over his soul or whatever it is, right? He's being sacrificed to these, it turns out, kind of demonic or demon worshiping brothers at this school. This demon is just a big figure, right? It's described as a figure, like a human figure, right? So the shape of a man that's just gigantic, that doesn't really have any features. Like it's described as kind of a blank or empty figure. And so thinking about abstraction, I mean, maybe I'll read like the paragraph where he's introduced, and then we can maybe think about like what this, I don't know, what stands out about this description, because I think I'm still trying to figure it out, like I know why I'm fascinated by it, but I'm still trying to like maybe parse out uh why it's so effective. But so there's a moment where the demon appears, and I guess I'll just read it. So then at the end of the room where the windows seemed to have disappeared so that he saw the stars, there rose into view far up against the night sky, grand and terrible, the outline of a man. A kind of gray glory enveloped it so that it resembled a steel-cased statue, immense, imposing, horrific in its distant splendor, while at the same time the face was so spiritually mighty, yet so proudly, so austerely sad, that Harris felt as he stared that the sight was more than his eyes could meet, and that in another moment the power of vision would fail him altogether, and he must sink into utter nothingness. So remote and inaccessible hung this figure that it was impossible to gauge anything as to its size, yet at the same time so strangely close that when the gray radiance from its mightily broken visage, august and mournful, beat down upon his soul, pulsating like some dark star with the powers of spiritual evil, he felt almost as though he were looking into a face no farther removed from him in space than the face of any one of the brothers who stood by his side. And I won't keep reading, but there's also, like, very importantly, and probably the most terrifying part, there's a moment where, without moving, this figure seems to like become like totally enveloping of Harris, right? Like it says that it, paraphrasing, but that the figure takes up every inch of space in the room somehow. And so, I mean, there are parts, again, I guess I keep kind of jumping back and forth and comparing this story to Lovecraft. Um, but I just read a few stories back to back where Lovecraft just explicitly states, that, this creature, it's not that the creature was terrible looking, it's that, nobody who had a normal estimation of size and proportion would understand what it is, right? So he like really explicitly states that the things that he's writing about are unrepresentable, and that's where the horror kind of lies, right? That these things are they just can't be represented any longer or for us or whatever, right? I mean, this is where I guess this is where what's interesting about Amygdala and Bloodborne is it's not that Amygdala's, I mean, it's scary looking, I guess, but the fact that there's something that you can't see that's there and that there's a moment where you start to see it. I mean, it could be a dog or something, but the fact that it appears at a certain point when it was already there before is what's terrifying. It's kind of not necessarily the thing itself. Whereas I feel like oddly here, the fact of like a featureless gigantic figure itself is kind of terrifying, even though it's like it's not, right? It's blank. This is maybe where I see that kind of parallel with Portinaccio sarcophagus, right? It's like those blank faces are terrifying, right? Because they're just emptiness, because they could be filled but are not, right? Or because they also seem to have uh, an origin that's cut off from anything we could understand. So like we can't, it's like an interpretive halt. So I wonder, I mean, maybe you can let me know if this makes sense. My kind of where this is taking me now in kind of a new direction that I haven't necessarily thought of before is that I think Blackwood's talking about what's abstract within the concrete and not necessarily where the concrete becomes abstract, which is maybe what Lovecraft is doing. I don't know if that's too hard of a distinction or if it makes sense. I do see this figure as being like drastically different from Lovecraft's, monsters or demons or whatever.
I think that's a really interesting way of framing the difference between the two. And I want to say without having, I'll think about it more right now, but without
Mhm.
at on first blush, it tracks for me um because part of what's going on here is that we have, how did you say it, what's abstract in the concrete, right?
Yeah, yeah.
That, I mean, so as you say, like part of what's monstrous and horrifying about Asmodeus, who, side note, the difference between Asmodeus and Asmodeus is like solid snake and solidus snake, or like
Yeah, yeah.
it's like Asmodeus would be that moment in a Souls game where you're in the DLC and you fight a boss and you're like, oh, I'm fighting this guy again, Asmodeus, and then it's like you have to find out like days later on Reddit that was actually Asmodeus, not
Yeah, yeah.
Asmodeus, because you can't, you're like too frantic, you're fighting him and you're not reading
It's like Rolana and Renala or whatever.
exactly, yeah. But what's terrifying about him is precisely that he's abstract and that he's huge.
Mhm.
But he is abstract and he's neutral. Like Blackwood calls him like the outline of a man, right? So there's a
Yeah,
sense that
yeah.
he's not even filled in, that it's like this
Yeah.
gigantic wireframe,
Yep.
right? Human figure, or like the space of a human figure with none of the details filled in. And even when, and then there's a kind of paradox because it's an outline, but also he has a face, but the face itself is neutral, right? It's not a menacing face. It's not a
Mhm.
glooming face.
It's a
It's a
sad,
face
I mean, it says
of
it's sad.
sadness.
Yeah.
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 And a kind of withdrawal, like expressing a kind of withdrawal or a kind of distance, I
Mhm.
think, a ruefulness or something, or even a melancholy, at the same time that it forces this like impossible proximity. So like there's also this interplay between distancing and abstraction. Even like an abstract look on your face could be like a kind of rueful, sort of meditative face, right? When we say he had an abstract look. Um, but it's like this abstraction that forces itself upon you, and so to the point where like where he again, I mean, we should talk about the spatial logics there, where like this being takes up every molecule or inch of space in the room,
Mhm.
but also when like suddenly the narrator feels like he's right there, right, and he like this giant face is also just like pressed so close to him, which is a kind of spatial paradox. Like if it was so giant, you wouldn't have a perception of the face because you would see like one pore or something. Not I mean
Yeah,
again,
yeah,
it's like useful to take this stuff literally because
yeah.
I mean again, I mean partly we're a games podcast, at least part-time games podcast, and so it's interesting to think how this would be represented in a game, and it's basically impossible because if
Mhm.
a giant face gets close to you, then it's no longer a giant face, it's just a regular face. But that part of the sort of logical torture here is that it's a sublime, enormous face that's also right there, right in front of him, like the face of someone in the room.
Yeah.
Um, which is, I mean, I want to say just perceptually and spatially impossible.
Mhm.
Uh, if we allow the existence of gigantic faces that blot out the horizon or whatever. Um, but this is like, it's also, I think that to go back to your terms of like the abstract and the concrete, this is maybe not what you mean, and maybe I'm going in a different direction, but I am thinking of like it's something that we can visualize, right? If for although sort of spatial logic is unvisualizable, the form, we might say, the content is totally visualizable and recognizable because it's just the content. The content is just a person, a human. Um, whereas in Lovecraft, like it's partly that we cannot visualize the content. It's not the form, but the content. Like so, there's that the Lovecraft story is like the color out of space, the color out of
Right.
time,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
is about a color that you can't that can't be described. Am I remembering this right?
Believe so, yeah.
And that's a case where it's like the narrator is just like, oh, I can't describe the color, but this color, this alien and human color that like sort of like drives you crazy, and it's like something in the represented world, like just a thing in the world, like this color, an object of perception. Whereas here, it's we can totally visualize the thing in the world, which is this giant man, but it's the way, right, the kind of physics of how this man exists that makes no sense, or that's utterly paradoxical, or essentially impossible, like a logical contradiction.
Yeah.
Even to the point of like, well, it's this giant figure. Again, to be very I'm always a literalist in these, and when when I read games and when I read literature, um, if this giant man is walking towards you, right, like they're in this little building, so you'd actually just see his legs or something. But he's like, it's like his head is approaching. So like he keeps talking about the head, but like their line of sight shouldn't be able to, if it was so big, how would you be able to see the head from inside the building? But of course, all of these are totally moot because the point is that it's just a kind of impossible spatial paradox.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and it's like I mean, and I think that partly it's just the like one thing I would say too is that I don't think that the fact that this thing is huge is even necessarily the terrifying part, right? I think that it's the fact that uh it's able to do things that somehow, short circuit this paradox, right? Like it is a paradox, but the fact that um like the term suffocating keeps coming to mind. I forget if that's the term that Blackwood uses, but this this demon when Harris is losing his language and like, not able to remember the most obvious word, when this weird Latinate name is used to summon a demon, and when he's suddenly being like, he has like a basically a noose or something, or somebody's tied like a thing around him uh to sacrifice him, that's the moment where he feels this thing impossibly just like, taking up every inch of the space. And I think that's what's unrepresentable, right? Like that's the thing that can't be unrepresented. It's not that we have a monster that's so scary that we can't describe it or something like that. It's that there's a like a dimensional, again, which is going back to a similar route that I think Lovecraft is talking about, right? But I feel like the method or the style of getting there through description is totally different.
yeah, the only, I mean, you can visualize it as a kind of gas or even a water, like Asmodeus, again, to be in the most crudely literal reading assumes the properties of water or a gas, like where
Mhm.
he just fills the room completely.
Yeah.
Uh, and so this entity shapeshifts or sort of transubstantiates into a different substance, or a different element, while still maintaining its form. And it is a nightmare logic where it's like the thing is both inside you and outside you. The thing is both like it's like, you ever have those nightmares where like the thing you're afraid of is both the room that you're in and the thing that's in the room, but it's like the room itself becomes malevolent even more so than whatever monster is chasing you or whatever like ghost is, whatever.
Mhm.
And that here it's like it's the space itself that becomes the entity, such that if you shut your eyes or hid your head like in the under the desk, it would still be inside of you. It would still be there.
Yeah.
So the sort of boundaries, maybe the being, Asmodeus occupying every inch of the room is a way, it's sort of a figure for, yeah, for the kind of inseparability or the total destruction of the inside outside distinction. Um, so precisely by occupying every inch of the room, which is a sort of physical, measurable, substantial in the sense of like substance or element, like uh, status change, right? Or description of something that's happening outside, you know, Harris's own self and mind. What it's really capturing is the fact that this creature has gone inside his body.
Yeah.
And that really there's no distinction between self and other anymore. If he closes his eyes, he'll still sort of be inside or be in the kind of most intense proximity to this being.
Yeah, I wonder, maybe this is like the last thing I'll say about it, just by way of another connection with Bennett Sims that you're making me realize right now, which is that at times, Sims's fiction, and this can be a thing that gives difficulty with it, or that can feel kind of frustrating, feels like it's pre-interpretive, or that it's already kind of interpreting itself, or because it is these fictions of consciousness, as he calls it. The characters are giving you already like every single kind of thought that they're having, and like not just thoughts like a narrative thought, but associatively, like as we've seen with Portinaccio sarcophagus, for example, I think is a great instance of that. Um, I wonder if, maybe in a way, I don't know, this is interesting. Maybe Lovecraft is kind of doing something more akin to that, where we don't accept it's this kind of disembodied fiction of consciousness, because it's not necessarily the consciousness of the characters that we're getting, but we are getting that interpretive thrust already. Like we're already being told, you know, normal humans with their kind of regular perception uh, would be able to make no sense of this. Whereas here with the Blackwood, we're getting Harris's firsthand kind of experience of this, but it's only in trying to us right now, trying to uh, pick apart what's actually happening, where this kind of unravels, you know? Like Harris isn't trying to theorize what's happening, and he's not trying to explain it. He's just kind of experiencing this demon is pressing against him from all sides, which is the terrifying thing. And it is terrifying because it's impossible. But he's not explaining to us that it's impossible, if that makes sense. Like
Yeah.
he's not like Lovecraftianly saying, this is something that's impossible that somehow still is in the world. He's just kind of giving it to us there.
Yeah, and that's a great example, another great distinction, and I think it's reminding me of the first time that I read the story with you at your recommendation years ago. My main takeaway was that I mean Algernon Blackwood was a better writer than Lovecraft, and I
Mhm.
think that's actually true. I mean, just on the level of like sentence craft, that the fact that as you say, it's pre-interpretive, it's left. I mean, retroactively, we get John Silence give some interpretation. That's a kind of coda of everything that happened as a kind of detective-like figure.
Mhm.
But in the moment, we're not having an obtrusive narrator sort of yelling from the stands, telling us how crazy everything is, which
Yeah.
is what Lovecraft will sometimes do. And I love Lovecraft, but
Right. Yeah.
it's a different narrative style, and again, it's a function of proximity that we're just like in the non-understanding consciousness's place. We're inside Harris's head, and then it's afterwards when he wakes up in the ruins of the school that some things start to fit into place.
Yeah. Yeah.
One quick question too. This is another sort of stupid question, but it did occur to me as potentially interesting, which is can a demon still be a demon if they just are an outline of a person? So to what extent this kind of goes to like death metal in a way, like to what extent does a demon have to bear the physical sort of generic marks of a demon?
Well,
Um,
this is my whole point, I think, about Blackwood, which is that, I mean, in the piece that I wrote for First to Knock too, this is where I find a kind of interesting connection with the way Blanchot writes about literature and about narrative and about plot, and the kind of he uses this term, I think, oppressive proximity or something like this, where we have there's this kind of odd shift that happens within a narrative and the character's ability to say I or what I even means. But at the same time as that, I think uh, it becomes also a question of genre where, Blackwood is is giving us the terrifying thing in kind of a roundabout way. I mean, it is more abstract because it's like literally abstracted, right? So it's like an empty form that we get, which I mean, I guess that's abstract in a way, right? It doesn't have particulars, so maybe it's generalized rather than abstract, maybe is a better term, right? But the fact that we can have that same effect and that we can almost have like the form of a demon rather than a particular demon feels to me like a step beyond, even though, again, it's a very restrained, almost seemingly negative or like pre-Lovecraftian thing. To me, in a certain light or in a certain mood, I guess I feel like it's a step beyond Lovecraft because we're given even more laid bare the fact of, this horror it's not about a demon. It's not even about being killed, right? You could just get killed in a different way, So like ultimately this isn't about death, which is maybe we'll have to continue our discussion of death metal another time, I think, but that is a relevant question too, right? Um, Especially because everybody dies, right? Everybody's going to die, so that's not necessarily the most terrifying thing, right? It's something else that giving us access to in such a stripped back form, I think is just like in a way heightens the intensity of it.
I mean, we'll have to come back to some of this. I think we should read more Blackwood.
Yeah.
I do like. I mean, this is purely accidental, but I'm pretty sure the last time we did a formless one, as discussed, we talked about um, we did Brian's Metal Corner, and then we talked. I think I talked about Resident Evil,
Mm,
and then we discussed a horror story or a fiction of consciousness, again to
yeah.
use that. So I just to our listeners, not every formless one will necessarily that we know of will follow that format, but I do like
It's a
the
good
kind.
one.
Right, yeah,
Good
the
form.
structural rhyme of that.
Yeah.
And there's a lot more, I think we have a lot more material to keep going.
Yeah,
Uh,
well, we need to read Mackin soon, is what I would
yeah,
say, because I don't know
yeah,
if
for
you've
sure.
read Mackin yet, but there's some incredible stories that we should read. It's like if I mean he's feels a little bit like Blackwood, but if Blackwood was a huge Dickens and Poe fan, um,
That sounds great. Also, pre-packaged, ready-made episode title, Mac in 99 or something. Mac in NFL 1999. Um, we should do a sports games episode as well at some point. But in the meantime, Brian, next time you go back to your hometown and try to go to your high school, because I know you have dreams about high school sometimes when you're on the train. Go back to your high school and then have a weird hallucination where you almost get sacrificed to a demon and then wake up in a construction site because your high school has been destroyed, was actually destroyed years ago,
Mhm.
in the middle of the night. Just remember to keep that magic lantern lit.
I
Gotta
will.
find your way home.
Awesome. Thank you.